日本とすればですよ、あまり慌てない方がいいですね。もう、右サイドにボールをフィードしました。マークに行きます。勝也切れ込んだ。キーパー弾いた。ナイスプレー。キーパーですね。松田がナイスプレー、よく今弾きました。手元の時計では今45分になろうとしています。さあもうこのワンプレーでしょう。なんとかここをしのいでほしい。ショートコーナー切り返すか。中ラストパスを送る。ヘディングシュート決まった。
One corner, one goal, one moment. That's all it takes to break the hearts of an entire nation. Okay, maybe that's slightly dramatic, but what happened to the Japanese national team on that October night in Doha genuinely was heartbreaking. Doha no Higeki, the tragedy of Doha, is what the Japanese themselves call it, and honestly, that's exactly what it was. A football tragedy. Reaching the World Cup for the first time ever was always going to be a landmark moment for Japanese football. By the early 1990s, Japan had established itself on the world stage in so many different ways. Economically, culturally, technologically. A chance at the last possible second in the cruelest fashion imaginable. That was a gut punch that resonated far beyond the football pitch. But here's the thing about the tragedy of Doha. It was a double-edged sword. As devastating as that night was, it may also be the single most important moment in the entire history of Japanese football, a history more than 100 years in the making. That goal, that silence, those players sitting on the grass in disbelief, it was the final kick in the teeth the Japanese football needed to become something genuinely formidable. The Samurai Blue, a national team that would go on to break intercontinental records, deliver unforgettable moments on the world's biggest stage, and one that might very much be capable of turning heads yet again at the currently ongoing FIFA World Cup. So, how did they get there? The first ball was kicked on Japanese soil all the way back in 1873. It was Royal Navy officer Archibald Lucius Douglas who, during a mission to Japan, introduced the game and its rules to cadets of the Imperial Japanese Navy Academy. And here's a fun little detail to sit with. The Imperial Japanese Navy itself was brand new at this point, and the Satsuma Rebellion, the last stand of the samurai, didn't happen until 1877. That means that for a brief, glorious window of time, the samurai and football coexisted on Japanese soil. Just let that sink in for a moment. For the time being though, football in Japan was little more than a fun way to get some cardio in. Things took a while to get serious. On club level, Yokohama Country and Athletic Club, founded by Scottish cricketer James Pender Mollison, became Japan's first association football club in 1886, and played what is now widely considered the first official match on Japanese soil on February 18, 1888, against the Kobe Regatta and Athletic Club. Tokyo Shukyudan, considered the first Japanese club founded specifically as a football club, followed in 1917, and the 1920s then brought regional tournaments and the Emperor's Cup. Important milestones, but what we are really interested in today is of course the national team, which made its international debut that same year of 1917 when Tokyo hosted the Far Eastern Championship Games. And oh boy, was it a humbling experience. Japan's first ever international match was played on May 9, 1917, against China. How fitting. The result? A 5-0 defeat. And then, just a day later, the Philippines handed Japan the heaviest defeat in their football history, 15-2. Yes, 15-2. You really couldn't blame anyone for rage-quitting the sport entirely after a scoreline like that. But instead, the humiliation of 1917 served as a necessary wake-up call. But the core problem was pretty simple. Japan still had no football association. That changed on September 10th, 1921, with the founding of the Dai Nippon Shukyu Kyokai, known today as the Nippon Saka Kyokai, or Japan Football Association. Yes, the Japanese call it soccer. Yes, as a snobby European, I am absolutely disgusted. But regardless, with the JFA in place, the foundation for a real national team had finally been laid. Football was promoted in schools and universities throughout the 1920s, and in May of 1929, the JFA took the important step of joining the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, or FIFA for short. Then the following year, Japan fielded a proper national team for the first time. And by proper, I mean not a university side passed off as a national team, but, an actual squad of the finest players the country had to offer. And sure enough, at the 1930 Far Eastern Championship Games, again hosted in Tokyo, they drew against China and shared the gold medal. Progress. International competition then continued throughout the 1930s. Japan made their Olympic debut at the 1936 Games in Berlin, pulling off one of the biggest upsets in international football at the time with a 3-2 comeback win against a strong Sweden side. They then entered qualification for the 1938 World Cup in France, only to withdraw shortly after. Then, as we all know, the world had a few other things to deal with. World War II, the sequel that nobody wanted. The world at a standstill, international football at a standstill. For Japan specifically, that meant no international matches between June of 1940 and March of 1951. Over a decade of complete footballing silence. But now, we find ourselves in the post-war era. Thank God, and the first genuine sign of promise for the next generation of the Japanese national team came at the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City, where they claimed a bronze medal in the football tournament, led by what was arguably the country's first true standout player, the striker Kamamoto Kunisuke. That bronze medal filled people back home with pride, and more importantly, brought a lot of new Japanese eyes to the sport. A spark for an exciting new generation of Japanese footballers, perhaps. Well, not exactly. The Japanese national team didn't exactly set the world on fire over the following 2+ decades. Japan didn't even make their debut at the AFC Asian Cup until 1988, where they promptly scored 0 goals and went out in the group stage. In short, by the late 1980s, Japan still rather sucked at this entire football thing, and a major overhaul of the country's entire footballing infrastructure was urgently needed. Thankfully, that overhaul would finally arrive in the early 1990s, 71 years after the founding of the JFA, when the association launched one of the single most audacious long-term plans in the history of world football: the 100-year vision. The goal was simple, if not exactly modest: win the World Cup within the next 100 years starting from 1992, which means Japan has until, let's see, 2092 to get the job done. Bold, ambitious, exciting, something that would clearly require some serious thinking about where to start. Unfortunately, the first step was fairly obvious: give Japan a professional football league. By 1992, Japan's top tier of football was still the JSL, formed in 1965 and made up of amateur clubs. So how do you build a World Cup winning nation without a professional league in this day and age? Well, you don't. And so, the J-League launched in 1993, finally giving Japan professional club football for the very first time. It was the first concrete step toward a bigger footballing future, and one that attracted not just local talent, but international veterans like Zico, one of the greatest Brazilian midfielders to ever play the game. Muito bem. The founding of the J-League was undeniably a watershed moment, but winning a World Cup requires a bit more than just a professional league. For one, you'll have to actually qualify for one first, and that was something that had eluded the Japanese for a very, very long time. Like, more than half a century long. Fun fact, Japan could have made their World Cup debut all the way back in 1930 when they were simply invited to participate in the very first edition of the tournament in Uruguay. No qualification required, just show up and play some footy. They didn't feel like making the trip though, so they remained World Cup-less for the next 10, 20, 30, 55 years. They very nearly qualified for the 1986 edition, but then choked against South Korea. Classic. Italy 1990 then came and went without them. The J-League was still years away from bearing real fruit for the national team, obviously, but even before its 1993 launch, the team was making some rather meaningful strides. In 1992, Japan hosted the 10th edition of the AFC Asian Cup and won the whole thing, beating defending champion Saudi Arabia in the final in Hiroshima. For the first time ever, Japan were the best team on the continent, and they had a major trophy to prove it. And so, they walked into the following year's World Cup qualifiers with their heads held high, as favorites even. And what they didn't know was that just as things were finally looking up, and just after they'd celebrated the greatest moment in the history of the national team up until that point, the greatest heartbreak in that same history was waiting just around the corner. Asian qualification for the 1994 World Cup ran in 2 rounds, with the first round determining the 6 teams that would advance to fight for the 2 available spots. Japan were placed in Group F alongside the UAE, Thailand, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Manageable opposition for the reigning Asian champions, and they delivered. 7 wins, 1 draw, 0 losses, 28 goals scored, and just 2 conceded. On to the final round, where they would face the other group winners: North Korea, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq. And this is where the pressure started to mount. Japan opened the final round with a goalless snooze fest against Saudi Arabia, then lost to Iran 3 days later. 1 point from 6. Not ideal. They then steadied themselves with convincing wins against North and South Korea, going into their final match of the qualification on 7 points. That final match was set for October 28, 1993 at the Al Ali Stadium in Doha, Qatar, and the conditions to qualify were as follows. Win against Iraq, and Japan qualifies for the World Cup regardless of any other result. But a draw could also be enough if South Korea or Saudi Arabia failed to win their simultaneous final matches. And so, knowing all of that, Japan went into the match and did what was expected of them in the first half. Miura Kazuyoshi. Yes, the same Miura Kazuyoshi still playing football today as the world's oldest professional player at the age of 59. Certified legend, put Japan ahead. In isolation, that could have been one of the most historic goals in Japanese football history, but instead, Iraq equalized in the second half. Then Nakayama Masashi restored the lead, 2-1. The clock ticked down as bad news started to filter through. Both South Korea and Saudi Arabia had won their final matches, which meant that Japan now had to hold on to that lead. And so, in second place on the table just behind Saudi Arabia, with South Korea right behind them, a few more seconds of solid defending was all that stood between Japan and their first ever World Cup qualification. A historic moment, 7 decades in the making, was within touching distance. Then Japan concedes a corner, the final action of the game. Iraq takes it short, whips it into the box. Final score 2-2. Japan slipped to third. South Korea, their arch rivals, took second and booked their ticket to the 1994 World Cup. Heartbreak, a bottling of sufficient magnitude to make any Arsenal fan feel seen. It is genuinely difficult to put into words just how extraordinary that match was in context. Japan had entered the qualifiers as Asian champions, riding a wave of national excitement driven by the newly launched J-League. They dominated the first round, they'd gotten within touching distance of the finish line, only to be denied by the very last action of the very last match with their fiercest rivals, the direct beneficiaries. Football really is something else. The Japanese media, of course, had a name for it almost immediately: Doha no Higeki, the tragedy of Doha. The South Koreans, for their part, call it something else entirely: the miracle of Doha, which tells you everything you need to know. Japan, unlike their dear neighbors from the Korean peninsula, would have to wait yet another 4 years for even a chance to try again. Little did they know that the despair of that October night in 1993 would prove to be something else entirely in hindsight. The spark that helped light the fuse on what is one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of international football. Because from that moment on, Japan began its climb to becoming the undisputed king of Asian football at breakneck speed. In the 3 years following the tragedy of 1993, the Japanese national team had some time to lick their wounds. When they truly returned to competitive action at the 11th AFC Asian Cup in 1996 as defending champions, the results were mixed. They won every single group stage game, before then falling to Kuwait in the quarterfinals. A decent enough showing, I guess, but the real test would come a year later in Asian qualifiers for the 1998 World Cup in France. Much like 4 years prior, Japan were convincing in the first round of that qualifier. The question was whether or not they could shake off the ghost of Doha and finally get it over the line. Well, the answer to that big question came on November 16th, 1997 at the Larkin Stadium in Johor Bahru, Malaysia. And this time, they did it. They actually did it. In a dramatic match against Iran that went to extra time after a 2-2 draw, a golden goal was going to decide if Japan finally went to their first World Cup or not. And what a truly golden goal it was. In the 118th minute, Okana Masayuki scores the goal that sends Japan to France. Frankly, one of the most important goals in Japanese football history. Just months after the 80th anniversary of the national team's very first official match back in 1917, Japan had secured their place at the 1998 World Cup in France. What a tournament that was, by the way. David Beckham kicking Diego Simeone, that Bergkamp goal. That iconic final that made 5-year-old me cry because I liked Ronaldo and Brazil. Brilliant stuff. And for the very first time in history, Japan was invited to the party, playing on the same level as some of the biggest legends that the game has ever seen. And all of that less than 5 years after that crushing defeat in Doha. And then they lost every single match that they played. Look, the scorelines really don't tell the full story in this case. They really don't. I mean, yes, Japan went out at the group stage, but all 3 matches that they played were competitive, and considering where the national team had been just a decade earlier, scoring 0 goals at the AFC Asian Cup, the progress was undeniable. But most importantly, the Japanese national team and the fans finally got a taste of that electric World Cup atmosphere. The greatest participation trophy in existence. And during the next edition, that excitement would be taken to a whole new level. Even before Japan qualified for 1998, it was already known that they'd be playing in 2002. Because, well, they would be hosting it, alongside their biggest rival South Korea, no less. The first World Cup ever co-hosted by 2 nations. The first World Cup on Asian soil, the tournament debut of a certain entertaining Brazilian who was at the time signed to a club in Paris. And for Japan, yet another landmark moment. And not just because of the hosting duties. Drawn against Belgium, Russia, and Tunisia in the group stage, Japan won 2, drew 1, lost none, and topped their group at just their 2nd World Cup ever. The run ended in the round of 16 with a narrow 1-0 defeat to Turkey, while co-host South Korea made it all the way to the semi-finals, aided, some might say, by a few generous refereeing decisions, before losing to Germany. But for both host nations, the summer of 2002 turned out to be an absolute football fairy tale. For Japan specifically, it was yet another undeniable step forward in an ambitious 100-year plan, and crucially, it was starting to look like that plan was actually working. If nothing else, the 2002 Japan squad was the first bit of definitive proof of the J-League's value. Managed by a Frenchman, yes, but built almost entirely on J-League players and early J-League graduates, including a young Nakata Hidetoshi. One thing was now very clear. The J-League was neither a mere marketing gimmick, nor was it a retirement home for names like Zico and Gary Lineker. It was producing actual ballers. And more than any other tournament, 2002 showed the world that Japanese football was here to stay. Perhaps then, it was a mix of that success and rising expectations that made 2006 feel like a step back. Managed by the very same Zico who'd launched the J-League in spectacular fashion more than a decade earlier, Japan arrived in Germany with genuine star quality. At the heart of it all was the aforementioned Nakata Hidetoshi, by then an established name in European football and arguably one of the best midfielders on the planet. He was magnificent against Croatia, against the reigning world champions Brazil. But even that simply wasn't enough. Japan finished the group stage with just a single point and went home early, while Nakata announced his retirement immediately after, aged just 29. After the highs of 2002, it was the first real dipping point since the tragedy of Doha, and it could easily have been the beginning of a sharp decline. But instead, the JFA did the opposite, because after Germany, Japanese football entered its modern era. The moment the Samurai Blue were truly born. " 2010 represented a fundamental stylistic shift. Trying to play like Brazil was never going to work, because frankly, nobody plays like Brazil. Arguably, not even Brazil plays like Brazil anymore these days, but hey, that's a different conversation. The modern Japanese identity, intense, clinical, collectively disciplined, that was initially forged around the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. In terms of sheer player quality, Nakata was gone, but the next generation had already arrived. Endo Yasuhito, Honda Keisuke, names that will mean something to anyone who knows ball. And that squad did something the 2006 squad never could. They came through the group stage behind only the mighty Netherlands, and in the round of 16 pushed Paraguay all the way to penalties before bowing out. Heartbreaking, but important, both as a result and as a statement of identity. A style was taking shape. And yet, back home, that style wasn't universally celebrated. The results were positive, the football many felt was not. And so, Japan went into 2014 having completely abandoned the defensive, reactive approach, replacing it with something altogether more ambitious. The idea for 2014 was pretty straightforward. Prove that Japan could not only get results playing attractive, free-flowing football, but go further while doing so. The Tiki-Taka era was at its peak. Japan had players at some of Europe's finest attacking clubs, Honda Keisuke at AC Milan, Kagawa Shinji at Manchester United. And from 2011, under new Italian coach Alberto Zaccheroni, the national team absolutely tore through its opposition. They won the AFC Asian Cup that year in stunning fashion, their record fourth and so far final title. But for a moment, it genuinely seemed like Japan was cooking. Like they could compete with anyone, playing any way they liked. And so they arrived at Brazil 2014 with enormous expectations. Then Ivory Coast overpowered them physically, then the 10-man Greece held them to a draw, then Colombia took them apart 4-1. Japan finished last in their group with one single point. Reality check number 2. Thankfully, a lesson learned. The build-up to Russia 2018 was dramatic to say the least. for 3 years, the Samurai Blue played under Bosnian coach Vahid Halilhodžić, who brought a brutal, physically demanding counter-attacking system specifically designed to address the failures of 2014. The players hated it. And so, 2 months before the World Cup kicked off, 2 frickin' months, the JFA showed him the door and handed the job to Japanese coach Nishino Akira. And somehow, against all logic, it worked. Nishino unified the dressing room, restored the good vibes, and just barely guided Japan through the group stage on goal difference. But the real moment of that tournament, and frankly one of the most memorable of that entire competition, came in a round of 16 against Belgium. The world's #1 ranked team, a golden generation, one of the tournament favorites. By the 52nd minute, Japan was 2-0 up. One of the greatest World Cup upsets in recent times was well within reach, and Japan's round of 16 curse was just 40 minutes from being broken. But then, channeling their inner October of 1993, Japan's players completely lost the plot, allowed Belgium to equalize, and in the 94th minute, a third goal hit the Japanese net. So close to something historic. And yet, the round of 16 curse remains intact. Japan would have to wait 4 more years, and when those 4 years were up, the scriptwriters of Japanese football outdid themselves entirely. Let me tell you about that 2022 World Cup. 29 years after the tragedy of Doha, the Samurai Blue returned to the Middle East. Because Qatar, the very same country where Japanese football's greatest ever heartbreak unfolded in 1993, would also be the country hosting the 2022 World Cup. The group stage Japan were drawn into was by far the most brutal in the history of the national team. A genuine group of death featuring a manageable Costa Rica side, but also 4-time world champions Germany and 2010 champions Spain. Oh, and one more little detail. The man leading Japan as head coach was a certain Moriyasu Hajime, who had been on the pitch in Doha on October 28, 1993, and witnessed the tragedy firsthand as a player. Just, chef's kiss, peak script writing. And then it got even better. Japan's first match of that tournament, Germany. Deutschland. A fallen giant with their own set of problems, sure, but still Germany. As expected, Japan went 1-0 down, but then in the second half, they scored twice, as if it was the easiest thing in the world. The whistle blows, 3 points against the Germans. Next up, Costa Rica, a side nobody expected Japan to drop points to. Japan, with a partially rotated squad, proceeded to lose 1-0. Just like the old times. Final group match, Spain. Luis Enrique's Spain. Japan went down 1-0 in the first half that the Spanish dominated, but in the second half, Japan came alive. Doan Ritsu made it 1-1, and 3 minutes later, Tanaka Ao converted a ball into the net that required one of the most extraordinary VAR checks in World Cup history. A literal millimeter of ball position on the byline, examined frame by frame. The call, goal. Japan held on for 40 relentless minutes against a desperate Spain side and finished the group of death, one of the wildest groups in World Cup history, in first place, as Mitoma Kaoru's bird's eye view moment scraping the ball along the byline by the thinnest of margins became one of the defining images of that entire tournament. That's what I call Japanese precision, my friend. In the round of 16, they faced Croatia. An aging squad, but one that knows exactly how to survive at a World Cup. The game finished 1-1 after 120 minutes of football, and what followed was a penalty shootout of the highest cruelty. Japan completely botched the shootout and were eliminated at the exact same roadblock as always. The round of 16 curse, very much still alive. And thus ended the most insane World Cup campaign of Japan's then 24-year-old history in the competition, and frankly, one of the most dramatic World Cup campaigns that I've personally had the joy and the agony of following from beginning to end. Disappointing as someone who wants Japan to succeed? Yes. Entertaining? You betcha. And that, as of the making of this video, is where the story stands. So where does that leave the Samurai Blue as their opening match of the 2026 World Cup against the Netherlands approaches in, I don't know, an hour after this thing goes up on YouTube? Well, the expectations are high. Again. If you're making a list of dark horses for this edition, Japan belongs near the top of it. Moriyasu, the same man who suffered through the tragedy of Doha as a player and then coached Japan to first place in the 2022 Group of Death, remains in charge for this one, closing in on 8 years on the job. He is a huge part of why Japan are one of the teams to watch this summer. He understands his players, and more importantly, he understands exactly the style of football that they are genuinely capable of playing. Disciplined, intense, counter-attacking. Style that, in theory, maybe shouldn't be exciting, yet consistently delivers extraordinary moments. Not necessarily because of flashy tactics or individual brilliance, but because Japan is a team you can never fully write off, no matter the opponent or the situation. Careful, yet clinical. Exciting not because they dazzle, but because they refuse to quit. Very Japanese, some might say. Maybe that's something that was hardwired into the DNA of this team by what happened in 1993, an event that their coach and millions of Japanese football fans have never quite forgotten. And hey, maybe, just maybe, the Samurai Blue will finally break that gosh darn round of 16 curse and go further than they ever have before. Dare I say it, could they even lift that trophy? Or they crash out in the group stages just like the last 2 times they went in as genuine contenders. Japanese football. Never boring. And that's the final whistle on this video. Something a bit outside of my usual ballpark, but I hope you enjoyed it. But now it's time to give a big thanks to my world-beating squad of Patreon supporters who make it all possible. Including the Hockey Channelman, Saxofox, D-Fox, Saikajo, Khalid Lepta, Xowiabu, Tricoat, Kevin Hickson, Buns, Journeyman351, RK0, Michael Smith, Hajimeno James, Utku Senkaya, Steve Matsui, Hypanen, Javier Soravia, Midnight Channel, Turam, Maruinu, Boo Cakes, Chris Scott, CJ and Mary, Cats and Soup, Chart B-Man, Ben Harradine, White Gilden, Sierra DC, T-Bird, Maddle Mama, Ian Farmer, Chris Wallace, JR Horse, Adea Okono, Guillaume Clement y Garcia, Ilya Kuznirovic, Jay-Z, Quintet, Microhacks, and Jules Schönefus. To all of you legends of the game and to everyone else who tuned in this time, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.